They told us that the Second World War was a story of light conquering darkness, of democracies uniting against tyranny, of a final victory that secured peace for generations. But behind the parades, the medals, and the memorial speeches, there lies another story. One sealed away in restricted archives, erased from textbooks, and buried beneath diplomatic agreements. These are the disturbing truths of World War II that governments decided the public was never meant to know. Entire divisions of soldiers vanished in silence, their atrocities ignored, their victims forgotten. Secret treaties condemned millions to death, while experiments in hidden laboratories redefined cruelty itself. Refugees, women, and children were sacrificed in the name of strategy. Even the so-called liberators left behind shadows of brutality, covered over with propaganda and silence. What you're about to hear is not the story told in classrooms or documentaries. It is the forbidden record, the long-suppressed testimony of witnesses, soldiers, and bureaucrats who left traces in classified files. These disturbing hidden truths, once sealed under top-secret labels, are now resurfacing like ghosts from the rubble of history. They force us to confront the reality that the war we thought we understood was far darker than we could ever imagine. Chapter 1. The Classified Atrocities of Unit 731. In the frozen expanse of Manchuria, beyond the reach of journalists and Red Cross observers, an unmarked compound stood hidden beneath the smoke of war. Officially, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But inside its barbed wire fences and concrete cells, it bore another name, Unit 731. Established in 1936 near the city of Harbin, this facility represented one of the most chilling chapters in modern warfare, a place where science was twisted into an instrument of torture. Behind the walls, thousands of men, women, and children were reduced to logs, the word Japanese scientists used to strip their captives of humanity. Their purpose was not survival, it was experimentation. What followed would be buried for decades under classified agreements and diplomatic silence. Unit 731 was commanded by General Shiro Ishii, a physician with a talent for bureaucratic maneuvering and a reputation for ruthless ambition. Ishii convinced senior officers of the Kwantung Army that Japan must master biological and chemical warfare to secure its empire. With this justification, he received almost unlimited funding, staff, and human subjects drawn from Chinese villages, Soviet prisoners, and sometimes captured Allied servicemen. Testimonies and surviving records describe in detail what took place. Prisoners infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax. Vivisections performed without anesthesia to study the effects of disease on internal organs. Frostbite tests in which limbs were frozen solid, then thawed with boiling water until flesh peeled away. Some victims were tied to stakes and bombarded with experimental plague-filled bombs to measure blast patterns and infection rates. These acts were not random cruelty. They were carefully logged, charted, and reported up the chain of command. The scale of suffering defies comprehension. Estimates suggest as many as 250,000 people died as a direct result of Unit 731's programs, though the precise number remains contested due to destroyed records and deliberate suppression. What is undeniable is the clinical nature of the atrocities. Unlike battlefield massacres born of chaos, this was systematic, deliberate, and justified as scientific progress. Ishii and his staff considered themselves pioneers, advancing medical knowledge and national security. Victims were stripped not only of their lives but of their status as human beings, reduced to data points in notebooks that would later become bargaining chips in global power politics. When the war ended in 1945, one might have expected Nuremberg-style trials to hold Ishii and his subordinates accountable, yet what unfolded was more sinister. US intelligence officers, aware of Japan's biological warfare program, saw an opportunity. In the emerging Cold War, knowledge was power, and Ishii's data on human experimentation was deemed too valuable to lose. Under Operation Paperclip's shadow, a parallel arrangement unfolded in Asia. Instead of facing prosecution, Ishii and many of his senior researchers were granted immunity by General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in exchange for their research. Classified cables between Tokyo and Washington reveal that American authorities considered the information absolutely invaluable and believed it could never be obtained in our own laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation. Thus, crimes that rivaled the worst atrocities of Nazi Germany were swept under the rug. hidden beneath a layer of classified agreements. Justice was traded for data. The Soviet Union, aware of Unit 731's activities, staged its own war crimes trial in Khabarovsk in 1949, presenting testimony from captured Japanese officers who described the experiments in chilling detail. But Western governments dismissed the proceedings as propaganda, further burying the truth. Officially, Unit 731 was barely acknowledged in post-war Japan. School textbooks omitted references, survivors were silenced, and former staff members quietly reintegrated into society. Some even rose to positions of prominence. Masaji Kitano, a physician who worked alongside Ishii, later became head of Japan's Green Cross Pharmaceutical Company. Others went on to occupy prestigious medical posts, their past erased by secrecy and denial. For decades, the full extent of Unit 731's crimes remained hidden from the public. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, through survivor testimonies and declassified documents, that fragments of the truth began to surface. Villagers near Harbin recalled strange outbreaks of plague, their families decimated. Former Japanese soldiers, racked with guilt, confessed to their roles in gathering captives and carrying out experiments. US archival releases confirmed what many had long suspected, that Washington had actively shielded perpetrators to secure their knowledge. Each revelation tore away a layer of the official narrative, exposing the moral compromises made in the name of national security. Yet even now, shadows remain. The precise scope of the experiments is obscured by missing files, many destroyed by Japanese officials as the war ended. Others are believed to be still locked away in classified repositories in Washington and Tokyo, their release deemed too damaging to diplomatic relations. Survivors and descendants continue to fight for recognition, their lawsuits repeatedly dismissed on the grounds that the Japanese government bears no legal responsibility. This legal silence echoes the political one, ensuring that Unit 731 remains one of history's least acknowledged war crimes. The disturbing legacy of Unit 731 is not merely in the atrocities themselves, but in the silence that followed. A silence negotiated by governments, maintained by institutions, and reinforced by a collective desire to move forward without confronting uncomfortable truths. For the victims, there was no justice. For the perpetrators, there was reintegration, even prosperity. And for the rest of the world, there was a carefully constructed amnesia, broken only by the persistence of survivors, historians, and fragments of declassified files. The story of Unit 731 forces us to confront a fundamental question about war and power. How much truth are governments willing to sacrifice in the name of national interest? How many lives can be erased from history if their suffering yields strategic advantage? In the secret agreements that shielded Unit 731's leaders, we see the contours of a post-war order built not solely on justice, but on expediency and Cold War rivalry. It is a reminder that history is never simply what happened. It is also what was allowed to be remembered and what was deliberately forgotten. Chapter 2: Hidden Massacres Behind Allied Lines. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the victors wrote the history. They told the world that the Allied armies were liberators, forces of light sweeping across Europe to crush tyranny. But buried within classified field reports and suppressed testimonies lies a darker record, incidents that would never fit the narrative of triumph. These were massacres committed not by the Axis powers, but by Allied troops themselves. Forgotten villages in Italy, France, and Germany bear the unmarked graves of prisoners of war and civilians who were executed without trial. Though scattered in geography, these incidents share a common feature: silence imposed by commanders and intelligence officials who understood that public knowledge would fracture the image of moral purity. The evidence of these hidden massacres lingers not in textbooks, but in fragments of court-martial documents, letters home from soldiers, and declassified archives that governments hoped would never resurface. One of the most infamous but least discussed incidents occurred in 1943 during the Italian campaign. French colonial troops, particularly the Goumier, Moroccan irregular units integrated into the French Expeditionary Corps, were unleashed against German defensive lines in the mountains. These troops earned a reputation for ferocity in combat, but once victory was secured, many turned on the civilian population. Villages in the region of Chioggiaria reported mass rapes, looting, and killings. Italian survivors later testified that women of all ages, from young girls to grandmothers, were assaulted, some repeatedly. Men who resisted were shot or mutilated, Official French reports minimize the events, dismissing them as isolated acts of indiscipline. Yet, US military police stationed nearby recorded dozens of complaints, and Vatican archives preserved desperate appeals from local priests. None of these records were made public during the war. The Allied command, eager to preserve unity and avoid scandal, ensured that the WWII's atrocities were quietly buried under the official story of liberation. In France, similar shadows emerged after the liberation of 1944. When German forces withdrew, accusations of collaboration were met with swift and brutal retribution. Many women suspected of consorting with German soldiers, sometimes as little as receiving food in exchange for labor, were dragged into public squares, their heads shaved while jeering crowds spat on them. Yet beyond this humiliation, there were cases of summary executions carried out by French resistance fighters, and in some cases, by regular Allied troops. Declassified OSS, Office of Strategic Services files, describe instances where suspected collaborators were lined up and shot without trial. These killings were omitted from official liberation narratives, painted instead as spontaneous acts of justice by civilians. But testimonies from American military observers reveal that Allied officers often witnessed or tacitly approved such acts, choosing silence over confrontation. On the Western Front in 1944, as US and British armies pushed into Germany, further evidence of massacres emerged. One documented case occurred near the French-German border, where American troops captured dozens of Waffen-SS prisoners. Instead of sending them to the rear, soldiers executed them on the spot. The rationale was simple: revenge for the Malmedy massacre, in which American POWs were murdered by SS units during the Battle of the Bulge. But retaliation crossed into illegality. Officially, the Geneva Convention protected prisoners of war, yet field commanders often turned a blind eye. War diaries of the 90th Infantry Division contain veiled references to no-quarter orders, indicating that captured SS men were often summarily shot. These entries were later sanitized in published histories, but the raw documents remain hidden in archives, bearing witness to a disturbing contradiction. Liberators committing the very crimes they condemned. British forces, too, were implicated in hidden massacres. In the aftermath of D-Day, reports surfaced of German prisoners executed after surrendering. One particularly controversial case involved the 3rd Irish Guards during the Normandy campaign, where captured German paratroopers were allegedly lined up and machine-gunned. Survivors' testimonies were hushed, and official inquiries were quietly dropped. British war correspondents never reported the incidents, and when rumours circulated, they were dismissed as German propaganda. Yet decades later, fragments of court-martial proceedings revealed that senior officers had received complaints, but chose suppression over accountability. The British government, determined to preserve the image of the gentleman soldier, destroyed or sealed sensitive files for 75 years, ensuring that public scrutiny would come too late. The Soviet advance into Eastern Europe carried its own record of atrocities, though Western governments rarely acknowledged them during the war. Red Army units committed mass rapes, executions and deportations, acts often excused as retribution for Nazi crimes. But hidden within Allied intelligence reports are accounts of American and British officers who witnessed Soviet actions with horror. Classified OSS cables describe entire villages in East Prussia razed, their inhabitants slaughtered or deported. Yet this information never reached the public, as Western leaders feared weakening their alliance with Moscow before the final defeat of Germany. In effect, silence was policy, and victims of both Western and Eastern allies were abandoned to history's shadows. What makes these massacres particularly disturbing is not only the brutality of the acts, but the deliberate concealment that followed. Senior commanders understood the power of narrative. For democracies that had waged war on the promise of moral superiority, the revelation that their own troops committed atrocities would be devastating. Thus, investigations were limited. Witnesses were silenced, and files were classified. Court-martial proceedings, when they occurred, often resulted in light sentences or were overturned entirely. Soldiers returned home decorated as heroes, their darker actions erased from the official record. Decades later, historians and survivors have pieced together fragments of these hidden stories. Letters from soldiers, once censored, now reveal admissions of guilt. Italian villagers passed down oral histories of the WWII's rampages, while German civilians recalled executions carried out by American and British units. Declassified files confirm what survivors always knew, that massacres did occur, but they were systematically buried to protect the reputations of victorious armies. Even today, some archives remain sealed, their release delayed under the pretext of national security or diplomatic sensitivity. The legacy of these massacres is twofold. For the victims, there was no justice, no acknowledgement, only silence. Their suffering was erased from the narrative of liberation, replaced with a myth of pure righteousness. For the perpetrators, silence meant protection. Many lived out their lives as honored veterans, their crimes forgotten by all but their victims' families. And for the public, silence meant ignorance, a history incomplete, crafted to inspire pride rather than reflection. The hidden massacres behind Allied lines reveal the uncomfortable truth that no side in war is free from brutality. They remind us that power, once unleashed, often blurs the lines between justice and vengeance. The victors may write history, but beneath the official pages lies a suppressed archive, waiting for those willing to confront the disturbing realities buried in silence. Chapter 3: The Forbidden Secrets of Operation Keelhaul. In the euphoric aftermath of victory in 1945, millions of people across Europe believed they were free at last. Refugees flooded Allied camps, displaced persons searched desperately for relatives, and prisoners of war clung to the fragile hope of repatriation. Yet, in the shadows of this victory, another story was unfolding, one that would remain hidden for decades. It was called Operation Keelhaul, a secret agreement forged between Allied leaders and Joseph Stalin at Yalta. The terms were buried in diplomatic language, but their meaning was clear. Every Soviet citizen found in Western-controlled territory would be forcibly returned to the USSR, regardless of their wishes. For many, this meant a death sentence. Survivors described it as betrayal on a scale too vast to comprehend, an act of moral surrender disguised as diplomacy. This operation, concealed from public scrutiny and shielded by classified archives, stands as one of the darkest secrets of the Allied victory. The roots of Operation Keelhaul lay in the Yalta Conference of February 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin met to discuss the post-war order. Among the many agreements reached was the repatriation of Soviet citizens. Stalin demanded it, framing the issue as the return of loyal subjects unjustly caught behind enemy lines. But the reality was more complex. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured by the Germans, many coerced into labor battalions or collaborationist units like the Russian Liberation Army under General Andrei Vlasov. Others were civilians who had fled advancing Red Army forces, fearing both retribution and renewed oppression. For them, return meant torture, execution, or the Gulag. Western leaders knew this, but with the alliance fragile and the war against Japan still looming, they acquiesced. The fate of these people was sealed not by their actions, but by geopolitics. The mechanics of Operation Keelhaul were brutal in their efficiency. Between 1945 and 1947, Allied military police rounded up Soviet citizens from displaced persons camps across Austria, Germany, and Italy. Declassified British War Office files describe collection points where men, women, and children were herded onto trains and trucks, guarded by armed soldiers. Some prisoners, realizing their fate, resisted violently. Others took their own lives rather than face repatriation. In one chilling account from May 1945, near the Austrian town of Lienz, thousands of Cossack refugees were handed over to Soviet authorities. British soldiers, under orders, used bayonets and rifle butts to force families onto waiting vehicles. Eyewitnesses recalled screams echoing through the valley as people clung to fences, begging for mercy. Many were executed upon arrival in the Soviet Union. Those who survived were shipped to the Gulag, their names erased from history. American forces were equally complicit. In Bavaria and Austria, US units carried out forced repatriations under the supervision of military police and intelligence officers. OSS cables describe the operations in cold bureaucratic terms. Repatriation completed, resistance encountered, losses sustained. Behind these euphemisms were human tragedies. Survivors remembered American soldiers weeping as they carried out orders, aware they were condemning innocents. Yet disobedience meant court-martial, and so the process continued. Trains rumbled eastward, filled not with liberated refugees, but with captives headed to Stalin's prisons. Some victims carved desperate messages into the wooden walls of boxcars. leaving behind final testimonies that Allied guards quickly painted over. What makes Operation Keelhaul especially disturbing is the systematic concealment that followed. Publicly, Allied propaganda celebrated humanitarian relief efforts in Europe, depicting camps for displaced persons as symbols of compassion. The reality that thousands were forcibly deported against their will was omitted from official reports. Journalists were barred from witnessing the transfers, and soldiers were ordered not to discuss what they had seen. In Britain, documents concerning the Lienz handovers were classified for decades, hidden under the Official Secrets Act. In the United States, references to forced repatriations were buried in military appendices, unremarked upon in histories of the war. Silence was not accidental, it was policy, designed to shield the reputations of governments that had chosen expedience over humanity. For the victims, the betrayal was absolute. General Vlasov himself, who had defected from the Red Army in hopes of liberating Russia from Stalinism, was handed over by American forces in 1945. He was executed in Moscow, his army of volunteers slaughtered or imprisoned. Cossack families who had fought alongside the Germans, not out of ideology but desperation, were exterminated in purges. Civilians who had fled westward, fearing Soviet reprisals, were sent back en masse. Their fate sealed the moment Allied soldiers loaded them onto trucks. Testimonies that emerged years later described suicides in camps as families chose death over forced return. Yet for decades, these voices were unheard, their suffering absent from the grand narrative of liberation. The cover-up extended into the early Cold War. With the Iron Curtain descending, Western governments sought to distance themselves from Stalin's atrocities, not highlight their own complicity. Files on Operation Keelhaul remained sealed, and public memory shifted toward rebuilding Europe. Survivors who escaped deportation tried to speak out, but their claims were dismissed as exaggerations or Soviet propaganda. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s, when researchers uncovered declassified files, that the full scope of the operation came to light. By then, many survivors were dead, their stories silenced by time and official denial. What remained was a patchwork of testimonies, fragments of military reports, and the unmarked graves of those who never returned. The moral stain of Operation Keelhaul cannot be measured only in numbers, though estimates range from 2 to 3 million repatriated. Its significance lies in what it reveals about the nature of victory. The Allies fought under banners of freedom and justice, yet when confronted with political necessity, they sacrificed human beings as bargaining chips. The very governments that condemned Nazi atrocities participated in an act of mass betrayal, justified as diplomacy. In the balance of power between East and West, individual lives meant little. Silence became the tool by which governments preserved their image while burying their crimes. Today, the name Operation Keelhaul is scarcely known outside specialist circles. Schoolchildren learn of Normandy, Stalingrad, and Hiroshima, but not of the trains that rumbled eastward in silence, carrying doomed families into Stalin's grasp. This absence is deliberate, the result of decades of suppressed archives and carefully curated memory. Yet the truth lingers, carried in the testimonies of survivors, in the documents declassified too late, and in the knowledge that history's victors were not free from moral compromise. The forbidden secrets of Operation Keelhaul remind us that liberation was never absolute. It was selective, contingent, and, for millions, a cruel illusion. In the end, Operation Keelhaul was not merely a betrayal of refugees. It was a betrayal of the very principles the Allies claimed to uphold. Freedom, justice, and human dignity were sacrificed at Yalta, traded away in backroom negotiations, and hidden under layers of classification. The victims vanished into Stalin's prisons, their voices erased from public record, and the governments that sent them there emerged untarnished in the official story, their crimes buried in silence. The truth, once forbidden, now stands as a testament to the cost of power and the fragility of memory. Chapter 4: Erased Bombing of Refugee Columns. War is often described as chaos, but the bombing of refugee columns during World War II was not a chaotic accident. It was a deliberate, systematic practice, erased from official memory and buried under euphemisms like interdiction operations. Across both Eastern and Western fronts, thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, were mistaken for advancing enemy troops, or worse, knowingly targeted to create panic and disrupt movements. Gun camera footage, buried in archives for decades, reveals pilots strafing lines of horse-drawn wagons, carts filled with belongings, and families fleeing the destruction behind them. Many of these incidents remain absent from official histories, yet fragments of testimony, declassified reports, and survivors' memories confirm the disturbing reality. The bombing of refugee columns was not an anomaly. It was an accepted cost of total war, a silent massacre erased from the narrative of victory. One of the most infamous examples lies in the firestorm that consumed Dresden in February 1945. Public memory often frames Dresden as the destruction of a cultural jewel, a city of art and architecture reduced to ash. Yet less often mentioned is the fact that Dresden, swollen with refugees fleeing the Red Army's advance from East Prussia and Silesia, had become a sanctuary of desperation. Eyewitnesses described streets choked with families dragging carts, mothers clutching infants. The elderly collapsed on stairways. When the British Royal Air Force and the US Army Air Forces unleashed their waves of incendiaries, it was not merely a military-industrial center that perished. It was tens of thousands of displaced civilians trapped in a firestorm. Survivors reported entire columns of refugees incinerated as they slept in public squares or suffocated in cellars where fire consumed the oxygen. Officially, the raids were justified as necessary to cripple German logistics. Unofficially, the presence of so many refugees magnified the horror, turning Dresden into a graveyard of the displaced. The Eastern Front offers even darker records. Soviet air units, tasked with harassing retreating German formations, often made little distinction between troops and civilians. Reports from Polish and Lithuanian survivors describe columns of refugees strafed by Soviet fighters as they fled westward in the winter of 1944-45. In East Prussia, tens of thousands of German civilians joined chaotic treks toward the Baltic, seeking evacuation by sea. Many never made it. Soviet aircraft swooped down on frozen roads, their guns cutting through lines of sledges and carts. Witnesses remembered the piercing whistle of bullets, the sudden collapse of horses, the screams of children trampled in panic. Official Red Army communiques celebrated these attacks as victories over retreating Wehrmacht units, never acknowledging that most of the victims carried no weapons, only blankets and scraps of food. These attacks remain almost unknown in the West, hidden by Cold War silence and the reluctance to portray the Soviet Union as anything less than the heroic vanquisher of Nazism. But the Allies in the West were not innocent. In northern France during the summer of 1944, after D-Day, US and British pilots frequently received orders to strafe targets of opportunity. To men in cockpits flying at high speed, refugee columns often resembled troop convoys. Testimonies from Norman villagers recall sudden air attacks on cartloads of civilians, some carrying white sheets as makeshift flags of surrender. Survivors spoke of fields littered with bodies, mothers shielding infants beneath them, only to perish together. Reports filed by local French officials pleaded for restraint, but their voices were drowned in the momentum of the campaign. After the war, these incidents were written off as tragic errors of combat. Yet buried gun camera reels, retrieved decades later, show that some attacks continued, even after it was clear the targets posed no military threat. The psychological toll on pilots is recorded in fragments of diaries and letters, some censored before they reached home. One US fighter pilot wrote that he could see wagon wheels and children flying through the air after a strafing run near Le Mans. His squadron leader reprimanded him, not for the act itself, but for putting such details in writing. The line between strategy and atrocity was blurred, and soldiers were instructed to maintain silence. Commanders framed these attacks as necessary, rationalizing that any movement on roads behind enemy lines could contribute to German defense. Civilians became indistinguishable from soldiers in the logic of total war. The erasure of these bombings was systematic. Official histories of the air war highlight strategic raids on factories, rail yards, and oil depots, while omitting mention of refugee columns. When survivors in Germany, Poland, and France attempted to testify, their accounts were dismissed as exaggerations or enemy propaganda. After the war, both Western and Soviet governments prioritized narratives of precision and necessity. Admitting to the intentional or reckless targeting of civilians would tarnish the image of just war. Thus, archives were sanitized, film reels shelved, and after-action reports classified for decades. The destruction of refugee columns became a phantom event, known only to those who lived through it. And yet the truth endures. In Germany, Oral histories collected in the 1990s contain harrowing recollections of families annihilated on frozen roads. In France, small memorials stand in fields where villagers were cut down from the air. In Russia and Poland, survivors speak of relatives lost to strafing attacks that no one in authority ever acknowledged. These fragments converge into a mosaic of hidden suffering. They reveal that the war's victims were not only soldiers in uniform or citizens in bombed cities, but also the unarmed, fleeing masses who were caught between advancing armies and aerial firepower. The moral implications are profound. Refugees represent the most vulnerable in wartime, the displaced, the starving, the defenseless. Yet in the calculus of World War II strategy, their lives were deemed expendable. Whether through mistaken identity, deliberate intimidation, or indifference, the bombing of refugee columns stripped away any pretense that civilians were outside the scope of destruction. It was total war in its purest form, where humanity itself was subordinated to objectives. The silence that followed only compounds the crime, for erasure denies dignity to the dead and prevents reckoning for the living. Even today, references to these incidents remain scarce in mainstream accounts of World War II. Memorials for refugees are overshadowed by grand narratives of battles and liberation. Governments remain reluctant to declassify full records, citing operational security long after the war's end. Yet survivors continue to speak, and fragments of film and documentation continue to surface. Each revelation pierces the carefully constructed myth of a clean war, exposing the forbidden truth that the refugee columns, moving slowly along shattered roads, were not spared by either side. They were erased first by fire and steel, then by silence and denial. The erased bombing of refugee columns is more than a forgotten episode. It is a symbol of the cruelty of total war. It reminds us that history's official record often conceals the suffering of those deemed inconvenient to remember. The victims remain nameless in most accounts, but their absence testifies to a disturbing reality. In the war that defined the 20th century, even the act of flight offered no escape from violence. Chapter 5: The Suppressed Crimes of Soviet Occupation. When the Red Army rolled westward in 1944 and 1945, it was hailed in official histories as the hammer that broke the Nazi war machine, the liberator of Auschwitz, the force that stormed Berlin and ended the Third Reich. But beneath the banners of victory, the advance carried with it a shadow of violence so vast that entire nations still hesitate to speak its name. As Soviet soldiers pushed into Poland, Hungary, East Prussia, and eventually Germany itself, liberation quickly turned into a reign of terror. Mass rapes, executions, and forced deportations swept across the territories they occupied. Civilians who had already endured years of Nazi brutality now faced a new wave of suffering. And yet, for decades, the crimes of Soviet occupation were silenced, suppressed by Cold War politics, erased by communist regimes, and dismissed in the West as inconvenient truths best left buried. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Soviet advance was the scale of sexual violence. Historians estimate that in Germany alone, between 1 and 2 million women were raped by Red Army soldiers during the final months of the war and its immediate aftermath. In Berlin, reports from German doctors and hospitals describe entire wards filled with women suffering injuries from repeated assaults. Victims ranged from young girls to elderly women. Some were attacked in front of their families, others taken away to barns, cellars, or bombed-out buildings. Soviet command, though aware of the atrocities, did little to stop them. Joseph Stalin himself is recorded as dismissing complaints, once remarking, "We lecture our soldiers too much. They deserve some fun after such a war." In practice, this translated into impunity. While some Soviet officers attempted to curb abuses, the violence continued on a scale that defies imagination. The pattern extended beyond Germany. In Poland, survivors recall Soviet troops committing mass rapes in cities like Krakow and Poznan. Hungarian villages were ravaged during the Soviet advance in late 1944, with entire communities left traumatized. Even Soviet allied nations were not spared. In Yugoslavia, Marshal Tito protested to Moscow about Red Army misconduct, but the complaints were ignored. Reports collected by British and American intelligence agents stationed in Eastern Europe confirmed the atrocities. Yet these documents were quickly classified, judged too politically explosive to be released during the fragile post-war transition. The West, eager to maintain alliance unity and avoid provoking Stalin, chose silence over confrontation. Executions and deportations accompanied the sexual violence. In East Prussia, Soviet troops carried out systematic killings of civilians, particularly men suspected of being Nazi party members or potential resistors. Families were often rounded up and shot on the spot. Survivors testified to mass graves hastily dug in forests and fields. Others were deported en masse, forced onto trains heading east. Many perished in transit from starvation, disease, or exposure. In Poland, the NKVD orchestrated the arrest and disappearance of members of the Home Army, the underground resistance movement that had fought both Nazis and Soviets. Leaders were lured into negotiations and then arrested, executed, or sent to the Gulag. The Katyn massacre of 1940 had already revealed the Soviet willingness to annihilate Polish elites. The post-war occupation merely extended the policy, ensuring that any threat to Soviet dominance was extinguished. The situation in Berlin became emblematic of Soviet occupation. As the city fell in April 1945, civilians cowered in basements and cellars, praying for survival. Yet liberation quickly descended into horror. Women were dragged from hiding places and assaulted, sometimes repeatedly by groups of soldiers. Priests and doctors recorded confessions from survivors, their notes preserved in secret archives long after the war. Some estimates suggest that as many as 100,000 women were raped in Berlin alone. Suicide rates spiked, with desperate families resorting to poison or self-inflicted death to escape further violence. Red Army officers occasionally intervened, but with little systemic effect. For many Berliners, the end of the war brought not peace, but another form of torment. What makes these crimes especially disturbing is the way they were suppressed after the war. In East Germany, the communist regime under Walter Ulbricht constructed a narrative of the Red Army as liberators and protectors. Discussion of Soviet crimes was forbidden. Survivors who spoke out risked arrest by the Stasi. School textbooks praised Soviet heroism and omitted all reference to occupation atrocities. In Poland and Hungary, similar silencing occurred. Official history condemned Nazi crimes while painting Soviet soldiers as allies. Those who challenged this narrative were labeled fascist sympathizers or enemies of the people. Thus, an entire generation grew up under state propaganda that erased their own parents' suffering. In the West, silence took a different form. British and American intelligence agencies had ample evidence of Soviet atrocities, but chose to suppress it. Declassified MI6 and OSS files revealed detailed reports of mass rapes and executions sent back from agents in the field. Yet policymakers in London and Washington considered the revelations too dangerous. At a time when fragile post-war alliances were needed to stabilize Europe and confront new threats, public exposure of Soviet crimes risked shattering unity. Thus, the atrocities were quietly filed away, classified under sensitive or restricted, and left to gather dust in secure archives. The result was decades of public ignorance, during which Soviet crimes were overshadowed by the Nazi horrors already burned into global consciousness. The consequences of this suppression are still felt. Survivors carried their trauma in silence, unable to speak openly even to their families. Some left behind diaries, hidden away until long after their deaths. Others confided only in church records or trusted doctors, their testimonies preserved in secret. It was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that many of these accounts began to surface in earnest. German scholars, freed from censorship, collected oral histories that confirmed the scale of sexual violence. Polish and Hungarian archives opened, revealing NKVD documents detailing executions and deportations. Slowly, the pieces came together, forming a picture long denied by official history. The suppressed crimes of Soviet occupation challenge the way we understand the Second World War. They reveal that liberation was not always liberation, and that victory carried its own forms of brutality. They show how politics, both during and after the war, determined which victims would be remembered and which would be forgotten. And they force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between victor and oppressor can vanish in the fog of war. For those who lived through the Soviet advance, the memory is not one of triumph, but of terror. And for the rest of the world, the silence that followed is a reminder of how easily suffering can be erased when it does not fit the story that power wishes to tell. The legacy of these crimes is not only in the lives destroyed, but in the generations forced to live with unacknowledged trauma. Women in Berlin, Warsaw, and Budapest carried their memories in silence, often stigmatized and shamed by their own societies. Families of executed men never received answers, their loved ones vanishing into unmarked graves or distant gulag camps. Nations lived under propaganda that denied their reality, compounding their suffering with enforced silence. Only in recent decades has this hidden history begun to emerge into public consciousness, demanding recognition. Yet even today, the suppressed crimes of Soviet occupation remain contested, with some denying or minimizing them for political ends. To confront these crimes is to confront the full complexity of World War II. It is to acknowledge that victory came at a cost, not only to soldiers on the front lines, but to civilians who endured unimaginable violence at the hands of those called liberators. It is to recognize that the truth of war is never simple, and that silence, whether imposed by authoritarian regimes or chosen by democratic allies, can be as destructive as the violence itself. The suppressed crimes of Soviet occupation stand as a stark reminder. In war, even the victors can become perpetrators, and the greatest atrocities may remain hidden, buried beneath decades of denial. The war was declared over in 1945, but the documents we have uncovered suggest that its shadows never ended. For every celebrated victory, there remain blacked-out pages, erased testimonies, and secret agreements signed in smoke-filled rooms. What we have seen are fragments of a deeper, darker reality. Medical experiments buried under euphemisms, massacres denied in the name of morale, refugees bombed and forgotten, populations handed over to their enemies, and civilians crushed under the boot of supposed liberators. These disturbing truths were not simply neglected, they were actively concealed, suppressed by both East and West, hidden behind the iron curtain of secrecy, classified in archives where dust and silence guarded them for decades. And yet, the ghosts persist. Families still search for answers. Survivors still carry scars never publicly acknowledged. Nations still wrestle with the weight of histories deliberately left untold. The closing of this record does not bring closure. Instead, it raises an urgent question. If so much could be hidden from the world for so long, what else still lies sealed, waiting for the day when silence finally breaks?